I'm Jono Buchanan, and in this video we're going to look at some of the metering options within Logic, because sometimes it helps to be able to see what you're listening to as well as being able to hear it. We've got a little mix track here which we're going to be working on just to begin to do some analysis and see exactly what's going into the making of this track. Let's just hear a few bars of it and then we'll have a bit of a look under the bonnet. Okay, so what I'm going to do is to drop down to the main output track. It makes sense that what I want to do is to meter or have a look at the sort of performance of this track from a frequency and volume point of view at the output stage. If I add the metering options earlier on to just one individual track, whilst I'll be able to see what's going on within that one track, what I want to do now, as my mix becomes a little bit more sophisticated, is to have a look at how all of these components are added together and what they're doing in terms of behavior at the output stage. So I'm going to drop down to the audio effects options here within the main stereo output track, and I'm going to come down to metering. Now there are a number of processors that are broken down within this drop down menu which allow us to do a number of things, and actually one of note is the BPM counter. If you've got a piece of audio and you don't know its speed, put it onto an audio track, open up the BPM counter, and that will detect the tempo of it. A useful processor, not one we're going to look at right now, but one to know about. But what we're going to do is to come down to the multimeter. Now what this does is to combine a number of these individual meters into one overarching plugin, allowing us to see in quite a lot of depth what's going on from a frequency and volume point of view. So what I've got here, at the moment we're not seeing any information because the track isn't playing, but when I press play, what's first of all going to happen is that we're going to see the frequency areas of this track broken down into multiple bands so we can see exactly how they're behaving from a volume point of view. So in other words, these individual blocks are going to show, and depending on how tall they are, they're louder. Let's just have a look and we'll see what I'm talking about. So the frequency groups that are active within the track are listed underneath here, and you can see that what we've got is this nice kind of graphic readout showing us exactly what's happening where, so we can detect or begin to understand how what we're listening to is working from a metering point of view. And this is particularly important if you know you're listening on a system which is compromised in some way. So in other words, if you're listening on not terribly good headphones, or if you're listening in an environment where you're having to work at really low level, sometimes entire frequency groups can be active within a track without you really knowing just how big a part they're playing. And sometimes being able to see those is a really useful sort of backup measure in addition to what your ears are telling you. Now at the moment what we're doing is we're listening or detecting in what's called peak mode. This is, in other words, detecting the peaks in each of these individual frequency groups. But what that really means is that if suddenly something happened just once, very brightly, very loudly in one particular frequency area, it would sort of light up. It would come and it would show me the kind of peak of that moment very clearly. What I'm sometimes more interested in is exactly what's happening across different frequency groups in a more kind of average way over a longer period of time. And for that, we can use two different RMS modes. What these allow us to do is to hear average volume in those frequency bands and see those in slightly different ways. You'll see how this mode change displays itself through the analyzer in different ways. Now RMS is particularly useful if you want to sort of have an understanding of how long particular frequencies are kind of hanging around. In other words, how long does my kick drum present itself? How long does it provide me with a real blast of volume? And what I can see over a period of time by switching between those different modes is exactly how my mix is energetic in different frequency bands, depending on whether I'm looking at that from a sort of slow response point of view or a faster one. Over here on the right-hand side, it's all about volume. It's all about what's happening, again, in terms of peak and RMS volume over time, rather than broken down into different frequency bands. So over here on the right, what we can see is the volume built up in those two different ways. So again, I can detect moments of peak, I can hear where my track is loud, and what I can also do is to see its overall sort of RMS volume. And because effectively my track's looped and no new elements are coming in, of course those things are going to be very consistent. But when you're working on your music, if suddenly a new element comes in, do make sure you have a look to see what the impact of those particular moments is when they're introduced. And what we've also got is a genometer. Now what this allows me to do over on the right hand side is to have a look on this second page, is to look at how the volume and frequency content of my sound is spread across left and right. So in other words, when I press play, what we're going to see is that the mono signal, the bits that are common to both sides of the mix, the sort of mono compatible part of my mix, is going to show here. And the taller the data that exists within the mix, in other words, the louder the mono compatible area of the mix is. Towards the left and the right, what we'll see is any parts that are kind of stereo, we'll also see how loud they are. The further up along these lines we get information both towards the left and the right, we're seeing how loud the bits of the mix are that are specific to just the left or right hand side of the mix. So it's worth restating that by adding the multimeter to a track, you're not actually changing the sound of it. What you're doing is you're using visual reinforcement just to check that your mix is doing what you're expecting it to. It's going to allow you to see the behavior of volume at different frequency groups. It's going to allow you to see exactly how sort of stereo your track is and how mono compatible it is. And in lots of ways, the multimeter can be used just to make sure that you are indeed hearing what you're seeing and vice versa.